but it doesn't snap into a value, right? So you probably
we did that. Yeah. We had that aspect. That's why we sought in each state to do two values, because we have the instance of the lower, the gradient of each state.
Yeah.
So we have different values as we go from the lowest
Yeah.
temperature to
We
the
can look
highest.
at it because it looks like, especially with the color and stuff, there's a moment at which the value changes and everything snaps over into another state, right? So it looks like you have an if statement which gets triggered at some point and something shifts into another zone, rather than it being a continuous gradation. But again, it's a small.
I know what gives this impression. I'm sure. I think that it's because the particle size changes immediately, so you can see an immediate change.
Yeah,
it's basically the particle size, because we have different particle size for each phase.
Yeah. So I think all your properties should be a continuous medium, right? So you could be more gassy, less gassy, more liquidy, less liquidy, and the boundaries are not so clear. It's a transition. It's a phase transition rather than a phase boundary. You see what I mean? But again, it's a small comment, right? Like we can work on that. But yeah, if the particles are snapping over like that, so you see this video is perfect. Like once the particle size snapped, also a lot of your forces seem to have changed. Like play it again. Okay, look. So now it's like liquid, 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 and then okay, it's getting a bit fast. Suddenly it snaps over, and the forces radically change. So I could see a transition, and then so that was much better in that direction, right? So I think it's just a matter of tweaking your variables. That's why I'm saying it's not a big problem. Like we can look at your code, or you guys seem to understand what I'm saying. If it's, you shouldn't be snapping over from one state to another. You should be transitioning between variables. But anyway, that's a small comment. But in general, you clearly have solved a lot of the problems you had last week of balancing the population. So this is already much, much, much better. The idea of introducing heat, you did very quickly, which is great to see, or temperature. And the fact that you're starting to see that, you know, what I was hoping you would see is that by using local introductions of temperature, you can generate population patterns. Even if you can see that at a small scale. So I'm pretty confident you'll see a lot more of that at the large scale. So that's interesting. So apart from that, what were your comments?
Basically, Theo was talking about, again, not just looking into the phase change of particles, also the generation of the phenomena. Like he insists of us looking into the phenomena as like the snowflakes, how they generate, and how we should go through that direction of like generating these phenomena, basically. That was mainly Theo's comment about it.
Mm-hmm.
Others, Shajay and Pierre, I think they like the idea of the phase change. Shajay was saying about looking what triggers the phase change, when and how these are triggered, and we should keyframe those basically and like highlight those more than just like recreating the phase change itself. And like he said that our computational was showing more about, you know, recreating this phase change, like the behavior itself, but he said we should actually look into the trigger itself. How and when are they triggered?
He said that it would be way more, that it would be more interesting to, instead of recreating the phase changing, like instead of trying to imitate the physics of the phase of its phase, to look into what actuates the phase change and to simulate this part. How, I don't know.
Physical what? Physical tours?
Tools.
Tools. Okay.
Yeah, but how to bring that to reality and how to translate that to an architecture, finally.
Sure.
Also, Pierre was talking about reversing these behaviors, reversible behaviors. I'm not sure what he means exactly, but it was interesting to hear that also. Who else?
Theo also mentioned, I think, he was insisting on the fact of generation. Like he said that instead of insisting on the particle system, he said that we should look further into how these properties of waters can be form generating, can generate form, can generate formation.
Mm-hmm.
And to elaborate further on the idea of generation from water properties, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Yeah.
One more thing could be, I think, also the phenomena and how we translate how we play with the physical manifestation and how we map this phenomena to the physical world, from the digital world to the physical world.
Yeah, that's going to be a big challenge for everyone, I think. That's clearly one of the challenges. Okay, so what do you guys think from your feedback and what we're talking about today? Do you have opinions?
Sorry, Mustafa, can you hear me clearly? I'm not so sure about my internet. It's good.
No, it's super clear.
It's good. Okay. Okay. So I think we have some lots of feedback from the jury. It seems like they all think our simulation at this stage is quite weak. I mean, not quite, but we're trying so hard for the learning scripting and Unity. In some sense, compared with like other studios, they didn't get what we are trying to do because of we're just trying to simulate with scripting of a bunch of particles at this stage. Yeah, but actually so about the platform, I know scripting is very important and it's our key frame at this stage. But like in terms of other platforms such as Touch Design or Arduino, maybe later. But that has some problems. Like we can generate lots of visual effects and very cool stuff, but it's without scripting we can't actually realize it in the later stage. But at this moment, I think from the jury they expect to see lots more complex results from yesterday. Yeah. So yeah, it's just some consideration about the platform. Should we stick on the scripting and try to learn more on it and try to generate some more complex strategy simulations, or we should try different platform to like make both things happen, like either from scripting aspect and also from the simulation part?
Yeah, I hear you, and I'll answer that in a second. But okay, like I don't think you need to worry necessarily about the platform. That's not a problem. I think what you're trying to say is the other studios look a lot more architectural than yours, right? That's essentially your main concern. That's not a problem of platform, right? Because you can do particles in Unity, you can do particles in Maya, and you can do architecture looking stuff in Maya. You can make architecture looking stuff in Unity. And, look, I know it's challenging, so I'm not going to tell you don't worry about it. It is challenging, and it's harder to make a translation from your world into an architectonic medium. or project. That's always the case in this studio, right? That it's a bit more difficult to make a transition because we're not researching a particular architectural phenomenon or a particular architectural, paradigm. However, again, like I was saying to the previous team, it's always pretty clear by midterm, by mid-year, by summer, how that stuff starts to occur, and we translate some of this work into a more tectonic medium, into a more architectural medium, right? So I completely disagree that the simulation is simple. I actually think I've seen the presentations. It's not that your simulations are simple, it's your simulations are abstract, right? So I think you should be clear about that. You guys have pretty advanced computation compared to the other studios. It's still pretty baby steps globally, generally, but it's abstract, right? The other stuff is just like, you guys did Maya. You should know that stuff is not difficult, right? It's keyframing. So, and I'm not talking that one thing is better than the other. It's not. One thing is abstract. One thing is a bit more representational, right? So it's the same comment as the heat team. We need to be super clear about what we're discussing, right? So, like, for example, I do think Shajay's comments are incredibly relevant to you guys. I'm not sure I understood Pierre's, and we can talk about Theo's in a second, but again, like, if you think about this concept of a meta material, that is obviously what you guys are working on as well, right? This computational medium. Again, the thing here is to abandon accuracy. What I mean by that is your job is not to make the computational equivalent of water, right? You're using water as an inspirational phenomenon, and you're looking at literally the physical properties that cause water to exist in the state it does. And you now understand that it's a principle of bonds, basically, right? Attractive and repulsive bonds in that medium that is water, H2O. And those bonds are heavily affected through the presence of temperature and the presence of pressure, et cetera, but you guys are working on temperature. And that creates these phases of the material, and the fact that this material can transition between these various phases in a fairly natural state, right? So the concept of how do you convert a computational medium into a physical medium is going to be a very interesting problem this year. The concept of how do you convert a computational medium into an architectonic material is going to be a very interesting question this year, clearly. I don't have that answer yet. You don't have that answer yet. I don't think that's a problem. I think that is the research, but you need to be clear about stating it like that. And, I think only in the last 3 weeks did we start to understand where this is going. And, this is the first time I expressed to you with ultimate clarity what I think you guys are doing. But because that's what I want to give you space to do your work without enforcing my opinions on it, right? But at this point, it's pretty clear that you're exploring this computational meta material and generating the rule sets, and you are effectively moving away from the accurate representation of water. That's clearly not what it is. And I think Shajay's comment is very relevant, which is, what is the stimulus for phase transition, right? Because that's an interesting addition to the concept, which is, okay, we're designing this transforming material effectively. That's what you guys are doing versus the heat team. It's a transforming material. What is the stimulus for transformation? We understand that the information is heat, right? Temperature. But what is generating that transitions in temperature? What is generating that? What is stimulating these phase transitions? That is an interesting question to research. And, Theo's question about simulating the snowflakes and these kind of things, I think that's an easy answer, which is your job is not to recreate the snowflake again, because that is, for example, we know we can do that in cellular automata. And, that has no relationship to your project in any way. However, you started to show the clues to it, which is by generating local difference, you create pattern. And essentially all that a snowflake is a repeatable pattern, right? That by generating a simple set of rules played out over time, you get local density differentiations, which manifest as material, which becomes a snowflake, right? Like, for example, if you do it in the cellular automata fashion, that is what happens. You just switch on cells in a certain way, and you get a pattern that looks snowflakey, which is this kind of fractal geometry. You could easily do that through these same principles you guys are doing. You just haven't controlled your system enough to do that, right? Which is through the introduction of local heat centers and the dissipation of that heat, you will get fragmentation and fractalization of the particle network, which will look kind of snowflakey, right? And I hope you don't think that that's the goal, because I don't think that's the goal, to create a snowflake. The goal is to show that you have control of this phase-changing material through patterning. That's why Theo's asking about the snowflake. He doesn't want you to literally create a snowflake. He wants to see that you're able to produce pattern, which is usually the number one clue of a computational organizational tool being able to create organization, right? Organizations are just patterns. So you want to see super clear patterns generated from a simple rule set. So like I said, the local introduction of heat in an undifferentiated particle network, creating these phase transitions in the particle network, which creates, let's say in your case, clumping, and in other areas, dispersal, which creates this kind of fractal-like pattern. So that's fairly simple. I'm not worried about that. I think what we should be thinking about, and you can also look at your early research, is, okay, as we're designing this computational material, which has its inspirations in the real world, but we're not literally copying a material, right? Because I think you can see that it's going to be very, very hard, if not impossible, to build a physical model of your material, right? Because we're not simulating mud, or we're not, doing something like that. Then how does this computational paradigm evolve into a design tool effectively, right? And again, like I was talking to the other team, that design tool will either manifest as a primarily tectonic element or a primarily organizational element. If it's a tectonic element, it starts to represent literally the material and the properties of that material and how that material responds to its environmental stimulus to create these tectonic patterns. Or if it's an organizational principle, we don't know necessarily what it organizes. Is it organizing material placement? Is it organizing other principles? We don't know yet. So that's the challenge here, that your work is a lot more abstract at the moment, and we have to figure out in the next few weeks how we start to talk about your project clearer, and then over the next term, how we transfer that project into an architectonic project, right? Because that is the pressure. But by summer, we have some idea of this translation medium, right? How to go from where you are now to something a bit more, let's say, architectural, to make it easy to imagine. Does that kind of make sense? I don't know, like, do you have any ideas about that?
I mean, it does make sense. It's just we felt like we were a bit restricted with the particle system. We weren't really looking the future, what this particle system can go from there. So when you just discussed it right now, I think for me, I can see it now. Like, I can see how this would play.
Yeah, you have to ask the bigger questions all the time, right? Like, that I agree with. I'm not encouraging you to be myopic and just like focus on what you're researching and nothing else. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say, when you get this kind of feedback, don't kind of knee jerk and revert to something that's easier to understand. That's not your job. Your job is to explain what you're doing better, right? You're not here to satisfy me or the jury by creating something we understand easily, right? That's not your job. Your job is to do your research well enough that it's understandable and we can continue to push it forward. So yes, you should be asking those big questions, right? And again, like to the similar team, where if we're talking about we're designing an evolutionary framework of a metamaterial rather than literally the production of the metamaterial, that's another opportunity relative to also what was Shajay saying, which is what does this metamaterial respond to? How does it define better versus worse response? All of these questions are what can help us start to make this a more materialized project or an architectonic project. And eventually that will also need to answer an architectural problem, right? Or a systemic problem. Like what architectural counterpart to the natural phenomenon are we trying to address, right? Because I think you understand, like, a natural phenomenon does not generate an architectural problem, right? Like, by exploring water and iceberg formation and snowflake formation, you're not going to suddenly generate an architectural urban problem, for example. You need to get the research to such a place where you understand what you have and what its opportunities are, and then you have to do a similar evaluation set of what architectural issues are you trying to address here, right? So that's why, yeah, like Tyler, I understand your comment. It's more abstract, and I think we can now start to ask a lot more. If we agree to start to define what you have now in the way we've been talking about it today, we can start to talk about the bigger questions of, like, how does this translate to something else? You can keep that question in your mind as you're doing research, as we're talking amongst ourselves, as we're talking with Theo, etc., etc., etc. So, and yeah, that's how your projects progress, more or less, right? But yeah, it is more challenging than having, these more straightforward, and I'm not saying that in a negative sense, architectural simulations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm trying to understand whether, like, in what Theo said that we should focus more on the computational we should orient the computational framework more to the direction of how we generate, how formations are generated. Now, is this the only way to do that? Is it to build a cellular automata for Snowflake, which I really doubt that how, I mean, I don't believe that. For me, I felt that this instant formation, instant change from higher temperature to lower temperature was much more closer to what a Snowflake is than to a cellular automata model. That's what I felt when I saw that happening.
Yeah, no, I can tell you 100% you shouldn't be doing cellular automata snowflakes. I think how you should interpret that comment is start to look at, and you're getting there towards the end of your presentation, pattern generation through your system.
So we should still try to, we should keep our model, the model that we created like this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And try to tweak these values very extensively until we see some patterns emerging.
You can add, you can tweak, but you can also push the model forward. Like, I think where you are now, simple things like increasing the population and, introducing these different heat centers and seeing how they allow you to generate various patterns. Like, you could see it at the end of your presentation. Even at a low population, you were starting to get local densities versus areas of no density, which is basically in a particle population how you generate patterning, right? So it's not about necessarily radical shifting of parameters or anything like that, although it could be. But yeah, basically the comment is very, very simple. It basically boils down to a lot of what you've shown us is your computational setup, which is look at how vibration relates, look how attraction relates to ice, look how low attraction relates to water, vibration systems in gas, etc., etc. Okay, cool. We understand that. What next, right? That's essentially what the comment is. And if you start to show pattern generation from your system, that is kind of what they're talking about as generation, right? Because in the world of particles, formal generation is these kind of particle networks that have some sort of clear pattern network or pattern behavior to them, right? Both in 2D and 3D. So I think you should understand your comments, which is, from now on, you don't have to, I think you did a good job this time. You don't have to focus too much moving forward on the rules, because you assume that people understand them, and eventually they become less important than the effects of the system, because the rules are your thing to control. The jury doesn't have to understand it every time. But you essentially have generated a computational material that has a concept of phase change based on based on particle properties of the population that are influenced by a clear variable of temperature. That's all we need to understand. And by introducing these mechanisms at scale, you start to produce a generative system, which is a pattern making system, right? Or that is essentially what that comment means to me, right? And so again, the snowflake is just a comment of pattern, right? It's an understandable pattern. That is what a snowflake is, or an iceberg. And these are, like I'm saying, these are all things you can generate, especially as you start to finesse your system, so the patterns really become much clearer in those high population systems.
I guess that an important question is how we generate the larger population, because now we were already struggling with these populations that we saw.
So for example, I think for a quick thing to do is switch off the spheres, right?
It's not that easy to switch off the feeling. Like, the struggle is there in terms of, I don't know, the tool is too hard to use. The coding is like very new to us, and we're taking so much time learning the coding and coding. That's why we didn't really expand further with our simulations. Like, I feel like if we, in parallel to Unity, we could use another tool, for example, so that we have, for example, a guiding tool, and then we have the main tool that we can script on it.
Yeah, I understand, but it's not that simple, right? Like, where is a tool where if you had a tool where you could generate your system accurately, that would be fantastic. But what is that tool, right? At that point, if you can find it, great. I don't know of one, right? It's not a Maya problem. It's not a Unity problem. It's the fact that you're generating a custom system, right? So the platform itself doesn't matter. It's the fact that, again, we're talking about this computational material that you've designed. So it doesn't have a counterpart somewhere else. Like, the only thing I could say is yeah, maybe if you put it in Grasshopper because you're more familiar with Grasshopper, you can do it faster. But apart from that, yeah, there's no that comment. I get your frustration and I sympathize with it, but there's no tool that suddenly just solves this problem. It's a fact of, and this is what I'm saying, don't stop, keep practicing, because that's how this problem goes away, is that you get more comfortable with the tool. You can use this time now to work with Octavian on your project rather than generic ideas. Just like, ask him, I want to go to 50,000 particles in our system, and we're stuck at 1,000, so, you just have to be clear that this investment is worth it, because in summer, suddenly when all of this starts to make sense, you can move 100 times faster, versus you move very fast now and you get stuck in summer because your tool is actually a stupid tool that you use now, like Maya. And you all know by now the wall you hit with Maya after a certain amount, because you can't simulate in Maya custom rule sets. So think of it this way: you're stuck. You're a bit stuck now, and you unlock the rest of your DRL, or you're unstuck now and then you get stuck for the rest of it. That's literally the game, honestly. And we took the other approach for 2-3 years before, and it's clear to me the problems, right? That the teams stayed at a narrative level. They couldn't really go deep into their systems, and I personally don't want to repeat that mistake, and especially for some pressure, like the jury doesn't fully want to see abstract stuff. But I sympathize. Like, I'm not saying you're wrong. I totally get it. It's difficult, but that's why you continue to practice, push Alex and Octavian, and it does pay off. Like, I can already see it's night and day in what you guys are able to do versus just 4 weeks ago, right? Like you're just 7 weeks into learning C# for God's sake, right? Like I appreciate your expectations, but you guys are moving actually pretty fast, right? It took me 12, 15 weeks to get to where you guys were because we didn't have tutorials when I was in the DRL, right? Like I just had to do this shit with Shajay at night. But, you know, so you're moving fast and I definitely appreciate it. And like I'm saying, like your computation is pretty advanced for where you are in the DRL at this point. And I really like that you want to do more. So push yourself. I'm not saying don't. But yeah, there's no tool that suddenly makes your life easier. Right. Again, like we can all give you the game of life rule to make the snowflake, but then what? Right?
Yeah.
Like, go nowhere. Like, I don't even need to give it to you. You know how to do it now, right? Like you just change the rule set from rule 1 to rule 42 or whatever the snowflake rule is, and you'll get the snowflake. But then what? Right? It's neither here or there. I think you're designing a system that can do something similar. Which would give you a lot more control and allow us to ask these bigger questions of this kind of architectonic translation. So I think that's where you need to focus, keep your system developing, keep it being moving forward. And we need to ask these questions of, you know, how do we make this an architectonic translation over the next, you know, 13, 14 weeks till June when you have your term 2 presentation or term 3 presentation. That's the real challenge here. And you know, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. That's the most exciting conversation for me because we're not giving up on the computational clarity to produce a really interesting tectonic project, right? So, you know, I think you're in a good place to do that. I think the move now is to clearly move into this pattern stage of the project rather than just the representational stage of the project and ask these interesting questions like Shajay's. And then we can ask these bigger questions like, how does this become an architectonic project? And I think these comments apply to all the teams, by the way. This is not just about the water team or the heat team, because I'm pretty sure a lot of the comments are very similar.
Okay, so yeah, I guess that we should focus on simulating more with the same model and try to figure out what the actuation is, how we could elaborate further with this.
Yeah, I think you should really start to look for creating pattern catalogs, like clear patterns at scale. Okay. Should we move to the air team?
Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
No worries.